The forest floor is black with rain. Somewhere above the tree line, artillery has stopped falling, but the silence that follows is worse than the noise. A single boot print fills with water in the mud, then another, then nothing. 4 men move across an open clearing in broad daylight, spaced apart, walking in a rhythm that looks almost careless. 200 meters away, hidden inside a collapsed stone wall, a German sniper watches them through a scope fogged with cold breath. He has killed 11 men in this sector alone. He raises his rifle. He waits for the pattern to repeat itself the way it always does. It never comes. The 4 men reach the tree line and disappear into the fog, untouched. The sniper lowers his weapon, confused, unable to explain what he has just seen. 4 months, German marksmen along parts of the Western Front reported the same strange frustration. American soldiers were crossing open ground, sometimes in full view, and surviving at a rate that defied everything a trained sniper understood about human movement. This is not a story about a miracle. It is a story about a method, one built for mistakes, funerals, and the quiet stubbornness of a few soldiers who refused to accept that walking across a field had to mean dying in one. To understand how that method was built, we have to go back several months earlier, to a much bloodier version of the same forest. Autumn of 1944 turned the wooded hills near the German border into something closer to a slaughterhouse than a battlefield. Dense fir trees blocked artillery spotting. Fog rolled in low every morning and refused to lift until noon. Mud swallowed boots to the ankle. Soldiers slept sitting upright against tree trunks because lying down meant sleeping in standing water. It was, according to several survivors' later accounts, one of the worst environments American infantry faced in the entire European campaign. Among the men sent into that terrain was a 22-year-old staff sergeant named Walter Kessner. He had grown up on a farm in Ohio, the kind of quiet upbringing that teaches a person to read weather and terrain without ever calling it training. He had been promoted twice in 6 weeks, not because he sought rank, but because the men above him kept becoming casualties. His goal was simple: get the 12 men in his squad home. His conflict was that the terrain in front of him seemed designed to make that goal impossible. Kessner's squad had already lost 3 men crossing open ground in the first 2 weeks of the campaign. Each time, the pattern was the same. A squad would leave cover in a straight line, evenly spaced, walking at a steady pace. Each time, a sniper hidden somewhere in the ridgeline would find his rhythm and take a man down before the rest could react. Before we go further into what Kessner and men like him discovered, it's worth pausing on something easy to overlook. If a story like this is new to you, staying subscribed means the next one lands in front of you the moment it's ready. German sniper doctrine at this stage of the war was built on patience and prediction, not raw marksmanship alone. Snipers were trained to identify patterns before they identified targets. A group of soldiers walking at equal intervals, at a steady pace, in a straight line, was not just an easy target. It was a predictable one. Once a sniper understood the rhythm of a group's movement, he could calculate exactly where a man would be in 2 seconds, 3 seconds, 5 seconds, and fire at that point rather than at the man himself. This is documented clearly in post-war interviews with former Wehrmacht marksmen, some of whom described their targeting method almost mathematically, less like hunting and more like solving a simple equation of time and distance. American infantry manuals at the start of the campaign did address dispersion, but dispersion alone was not enough. Men could be spread 10 meters apart and still die in the same afternoon, because spacing solved the problem of a single shell hitting multiple soldiers, not the problem of a sniper predicting a single soldier's position. It was in small, informal ways, squad by squad, that soldiers began changing how they moved. Not through a manual. Through grief. After losing his 3rd man, Kessner reportedly stopped his squad in place, according to accounts later given by 2 surviving members, and made them walk the same stretch of open ground twice, once the old way, once with each man choosing his own pace, his own pauses, his own direction shifts, as long as the group's rough shape stayed intact. It looked disorganized. It looked, to any outside observer, like poor discipline. That was, in a strange way, exactly the point. Picture the clearing now, seen from that same stone wall. Instead of 4 evenly spaced silhouettes moving at one shared rhythm, the sniper sees one soldier pause behind a fallen log for 2 full seconds, another quicken his pace unpredictably, a third crouch briefly as if checking something on the ground, a fourth drift several meters off the expected line entirely. None of these movements are random in the truest sense. Each soldier has learned to break his own rhythm deliberately, constantly, without ever discussing it as a formal tactic. To an enemy trained to calculate a moving target's future position, unpredictability is the one variable no equation can solve for. This wasn't the invention of one genius or one general. It emerged in fragments, across different units, often without any of them knowing the others were doing the same thing. That detail matters, because it tells us something about how survival knowledge spreads in war. Not always from the top down. Sometimes from squad to squad, from one funeral to the next, carried by men who simply refused to lose another friend the same way twice. There is a letter, preserved in a regimental archive and later quoted in a Veterans Association newsletter, written by a private in a neighboring company describing almost the identical technique, independently developed, weeks before Kestner's squad began using it. The private wrote to his sister that the men had started calling it, informally, walking wrong on purpose. The phrase never appeared in any official army document. It didn't need to. It worked, and word of it moved faster than any printed order could. If a detail like that surprises you, it's worth sitting with for a moment, because it says something about how ordinary soldiers, without training in psychology or ballistics, arrived at a solution that unknowingly matched exactly what made them harder to predict. By early winter, reports from German positions along parts of the front had grown noticeably more frustrated. Interrogation records from captured German soldiers, cross-referenced with Allied intelligence summaries from the period, described snipers complaining that American infantry had, in their words, stopped moving like soldiers. One record describes a marksman who held his position for over 3 hours without firing a single shot, unable to establish a reliable pattern in the men crossing his field of view. This is where the story could have simply ended, a clever adaptation, a quiet tactical footnote in a much larger campaign. But there is a second layer to this, one that involves Kestner directly, and one that very few accounts of this technique ever mention. In December, Kestner's squad was ordered to cross a stretch of open farmland to relieve a forward position that had lost radio contact. The distance was roughly 300 meters, almost entirely without cover, in daylight, with visibility only slightly reduced by drizzle. According to the 2 surviving members interviewed decades later for a local historical society project, every man in that squad understood this crossing might be the one none of them walked away from. Kestner split his squad into 2 loose groups instead of one line, staggering their timing by several seconds, each man choosing his own irregular pace exactly as they had practiced weeks earlier without ever calling it practice. Halfway across, a shot rang out. It missed. A second shot followed seconds later. It also missed. According to the account, the sniper fired 4 times that afternoon, each shot landing where a man would have been standing under the old, predictable rhythm, and each time landing on empty ground instead, because the men were no longer where the pattern said they should be. All 6 men reached the forward position alive. This single crossing became something of a quiet legend within the regiment, repeated soldier to soldier long before it was ever written down anywhere official. It is worth remembering, at this point in the story, that most of what made this technique effective was never printed in a training manual during the war itself. If this kind of hidden history, the kind that survives only in letters and oral memory rather than official records, is something you'd want to see more of, leaving a comment about what stood out most is often what shapes which stories get told next. The technique Kestner's squad refined by instinct would later be studied, in a much more formal way, by military analysts after the war. Reports compiled by the Army's Historical Division in the years following 1945 examined small unit survival rates across different terrain types and found a consistent pattern. Units that maintained rigid uniform movement in open terrain suffered significantly higher casualty rates from enemy marksmen than units that moved with irregular pacing and staggered timing, even when both groups faced comparable enemy positions and comparable levels of cover. This later became partially formalized into broader infantry movement doctrine, encouraging irregular pacing and unpredictable spacing across open terrain, though largely stripped of the specific origin story, the muddy forest, the grieving sergeant, the phrase walking wrong on purpose that never made it into any official glossary. Walter Kestner survived the war. He returned to Ohio in 1945, worked the same farm he had grown up on, and rarely spoke about what had happened in that forest. In one of the only recorded interviews he gave, decades later, to a local newspaper covering veterans of the campaign, he described the method not as tactics, but as something closer to listening. He said the land and the enemy were both trying to teach you something, and the men who survived were usually just the ones paying enough attention to notice. Not every squad that tried irregular movement survived using it. It was never a guarantee, only a shift in probability, a way of making an impossible crossing slightly less impossible. Several of the men who first developed the method were killed later in the campaign, in different circumstances entirely, a reminder that no adaptation in war offers permanent safety, only a narrower window of chance. What makes this story worth telling isn't a clean victory or a single decisive moment. It's the picture of ordinary soldiers, untrained in ballistics or psychology, working out through repeated loss what a targeting system depended on, and quietly denying it that dependency. No general ordered it. No manual described it first. It began as grief translated into motion, and it ended as something that, in small but measurable ways, kept men alive who might otherwise have become another name added to a casualty list. If this is the kind of history that tends to stay with you long after the video ends, sharing it with someone who'd appreciate the same kind of story is often how these accounts keep reaching people who'd otherwise never hear them. The clearing in that forest is still there today, quieter now, the stone wall mostly collapsed into the undergrowth, the field itself returned to farmland. Nothing marks what happened there. No plaque, no sign. Only the accounts of a handful of men who once walked across it, deliberately, unpredictably, choosing their own rhythm in a place built to punish exactly that kind of choice, and who lived long enough afterward to tell people what it had taken to do it.